So a friend of mine mentioned she was trying to categorize all the books she had read last year, and she realized that the books that I had recommended didn't really fit in any of her categories, and that's kind of intentional for me, is I think the books that I recommend to people, most of the time they're books that are unusual in some way, don't fit into molds easily, and that's also tends to be what I seek out, is I tend to try to seek out books that are going to give me a perspective I don't always have. And my video on frameworks is taking off. Looks like that might be one of my most popular videos. So I figured this is a good follow-up video because I think this is a big part of how I learn different frameworks. And having different frameworks, different ways of viewing the world, still isn't necessarily going to save you from making dumb mistakes, getting too attached to the way you view the world. But if I think about where I have suffered from following the conventional wisdom too much, it's generally because I've refused to go certain places, and I've been trying to get away from that. And I'm going to have a separate video on extremist stuff, but this video is just going to be stuff that wouldn't be considered like extreme or dangerous, but is just, these books are unusual in different ways, and they're books that I think for the most part people will not have heard of, with one exception. They're also all books that I have read, with again one exception, and I'll get to that. And they're also mostly books that I feel like I've clearly gotten something out, and I might make a follow-up video on books where I tried to do this and I don't feel like I got something out of them. I might even have DNF'd them. But I've been thinking about, so I actually mentioned these two books, which you almost certainly will have heard of this one. And these are not really the list, but I've mentioned in previous videos. I read both of these books, sort of challenging myself to read things that I was uncomfortable with. This one because it was woo. This one because I am skeptical of most critical theory, and particularly anything that references Freud or Lacan heavily, even though I admire Lasch references Freud, but especially Lacan. And yet, this was helpful for me in terms of thinking about how do you actually define what a conspiracy theory is, and the advice in this book is just good advice despite coming from woo. And so these are not part of the list. These are, you'll almost certainly have heard of this one if you know anything about self-help or been on Amazon. It just recommend it to everybody. And this one, if you're familiar with academic philosophy, I imagine you've heard of, if not this woman, some of the people in this series. But then, this is the one book on this list that you may well have heard of, Gaia by James Lovelock. And the way my father presented the Gaia hypothesis to me as a child, I basically understood it as Gaia was like the Greek goddess Gaia, like that was the earth, the ecosystem, and she was deliberately getting revenge on us, which is very much not what this is. And I actually think I covered this a little bit in my blog post. And this book is interesting because it is a good introduction to homeostasis, which I think is a concept that people really don't understand and should. I might make a follow-up video on that. And it's also a good look at emergent order and how things happen organically. I'm going to definitely make videos more on that subject in the future. But then after this, all of these books I'm going to talk about are probably less well known, and two of them are sort of what I'd think of as YouTuber books because the people who wrote them have or had prominent YouTube channels. And this one this is the one that I haven't read, but I found her YouTube channel, and the way she presents things, I disagree with a lot of it, but I also agree with some of her analysis. And I've mentioned, like, that is generally the best combination for me, is books that are, I agree on parts and I disagree with parts. I'm like, okay, I agree with this part, I don't agree with this part. Why? Where are you losing me? And she seems to be operating under the constrained vision. I've talked about that topic, Thomas Sowell's idea of the constrained or tragic vision versus unconstrained vision. But she's promoting ideas that would typically be associated with the left, which, as someone who believes in the constrained vision but has historically associated more with the left, I'm like, I am curious to see this take. And is she actually seeming to operate under the constrained vision? Or am I like, as I look at more, oh, it actually is unconstrained. It's just, well, we'll see. This is the one I haven't read, but I'm definitely going to read. Her channel intrigued me enough to get it. And then this one will be in a video that's coming out around, I don't know if before or after this one. This is the book by Breakdancing Dad, his business self-help book. He went viral because of a dispute with his influencer daughter. And I'm going to have more to say on this book, and I haven't seen his channel even, just people responding to the dispute, and I was like, oh, this actually seems interesting. But as I will say in this other video, I'm like, oh, these are actually, like, it's not organized as a typical self-help book, but it's, again, a mixture of stuff that I already agree with and think I know, and stuff that I'm like, I don't agree with this, and I have to think about why, and maybe I can apply it. So these two are sort of YouTuber books. And then speaking of YouTube, this is a book that I've mentioned some video. the YouTuber World Building Notes, who she is basically on hiatus at this point, but when she was uploading, she would do yearly, these are some of my favorite books, and I like Ursula Le Guin, who translated this. And this book, I wasn't necessarily skeptical of, but I had no idea what to expect. And it is a story, basically the city is the character, and people come and go. And I watched some booktuber video recently, I think it might have been Allison actually, talking about, can you have a book without characters? And the person responded in her comments, well, what I was actually saying was, if the characters are very distant, then it is a book without characters. And I think this book could possibly qualify. And it has stuck with me, and it's one of the few books that I reread before I started actively making a point to try to reread stuff. And then I guess I will stay in speculative fiction by, I read a lot of alternate history when I was a kid, and this was one that I wanted to read, but I weirdly couldn't find it. I don't know, because I eventually discovered I could do interlibrary loan really easily in Massachusetts if I looked after that. But I wanted to read it as an adult because Terry Bisson is a committed communist who believes that central planning is possible. And he wrote this utopian future in which Harriet Tubman joins John Brown's raid, and they create a socialist, racially integrated Confederate States, basically, that is outperforming the US. And so you have this contradiction between the prosperous, very equal southern US and then the very backwards northern US. And even though I don't agree with his premises that central planning is possible, much less that you could make a socialist utopia in the southern US, it's still an inspiring idea, and it is really well written, and I would actually recommend this book to people. And then 2 other speculative fiction books. So this one, I mentioned some of Sean McMullen's short stories before, but this is a novel that I think might have been a fix-up of some of these stories, and then there are 2 follow-ups that I haven't read, but it's set in a distant future where we've basically lost technology, but we understand computation, and so we have human computers and human-driven rail systems and stuff in Australia. And it's a book that stuck with me and that I want to reread and probably read the rest of the series at some point. Although the descriptions, the summary of the series sounded less compelling than just the first book here. And then similarly, so I think I mentioned my 2 favorite living science fiction fantasy writers are Ted Chiang and Ken Liu. My 3rd favorite is Eleanor Arnason, and mostly in her short stories, but this is her most famous novel, and it won the Tiptree Award, which I want to talk about the renaming of the Tiptree Award at some point, but save that for a future video. And this presents a world in which the intelligent species kind of has the gender social system of elephants, where women and children live together, and this is actually pretty common among mammals, but then the males go off on their own, and the women meet the males to mate, but otherwise the males cannot be in the society, even though they're an intelligent species. And this book is a very slow, very atmospheric book, which also, this was when I was still identifying as non-binary and struggling with gender issues, so the idea of, a whole civilized world where the males can't interact with people was uncomfortable. But it was really well written, really engaging, another book that I am likely to reread at some point. And then one more sort of speculative fictionist book. It's a collection of basically modern folk tales by a writer I had not heard of. And Amazon was calling him the American Tolkien, which obviously that's not going to be someone you haven't heard of. If I was going to make a case for there being an American Tolkien, I'd say it's probably Isaac Asimov, but maybe I'll make another video about that. However, these are really good sort of ghost stories set in Appalachian, North Carolina. And I have actually made a point of not finishing this book because the stories are so short that I'm like, I want to bring this book with me potentially when I have a few doctor's appointments coming up. And so I'm going to do that then. And I'm going to make a video on books that are good for bringing with you based on being short. But this is one where I made a point. I'm like, I want to actually read this when I'm in a waiting room and I don't know how long it'll be. And then 2 more. So then this one is basically, it's a book by an Australian Aboriginal on Indigenous ways of knowing, which is a topic that I don't think I've ever been as skeptical as a lot of supposedly rationalist people are, but I also come from a rural area, and so I understand the value of folk traditions, especially about the land. And this guy, I think, grew up in an urban area, and so he's trying to reconnect with his roots, and I did not finish this one, and I don't remember anything explicitly about it, but I also didn't say, okay, this is dumb, like I have with some of these books that I might make another video about, and I want to revisit it. So this is another one I haven't fully read, but I read, I don't know, quarter, third this book. And then finally, Friedrich Reck, Diary of a Man in Despair. So this guy was an example. There are several people I know who were basically so reactionary that they hated the Nazis and fascists because they thought they were too progressive. And he is one such person. And his criticisms of Mass Man, I have an issue with the way that he is sort of framing it as the problem is with the people themselves and not the institutions we've built. But I think he's kind of on his money, and he was a big critic of Hitler, obviously. And he actually, one thing that makes this compelling is he had skin in the game. He was hiding his diary in his barn, arrested by the Nazis once, kept writing this, and then eventually he was caught. This wasn't found, but he still died in a concentration camp just before the camp was liberated. And so, this was not him revising after the fact. He was anti-Hitler now. And his argument that the Nazis kind of came out of these institutions, which parallels what Friedrich Hayek argued in The Road to Serfdom, is interesting, and I might have more to say about that. But I also think this is just, there are a few books where I cannot put it down. This was one of them. I read this all the way through in one sitting. I could not put it down. Read it all the way through without getting up because it was really compellingly written. And then, as I said afterwards, I've sort of been thinking about his take on Mass Man because it agrees with a lot of what I believe, but the framing of it's the people themselves I don't agree with. And so anyway, so these are just some books that I was looking through and I'm saying, okay, what are books that I've read, or in one case I'm going to read, that are pretty weird, like in the scheme of things. And with Eleanor Arnason, this is more conventional than a lot of her stuff. I was actually looking for a collection of her short stories that I couldn't find, but I'm like, this still kind of applies because writing an atmospheric novel like this, and then also writing a novel that is so focused on, you have an alternative gender system, and then the aliens are trying to live in a way that would be more how humans live. I love these books that are written from like alien perspectives and from those assumptions, and they're rare because they don't sell well generally. And this won the Tiptree Award, so it probably sold reasonably well. But anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.